Welcome back. I'm Chris Moore with HVAC Pro Blog, and this month I'm really excited to share a training that I did for my Patreon members 1 year ago this month. It's on HVAC quality installation and the specification. So in this training, we walk through the purpose and the scope of this standard developed by ACA and ANSI, right? We're going to talk about equipment, installation, duct distribution, system design, and owner education aspects of this particular standard. If you like this training, make sure you subscribe to the channel, HVAC Pro Blog, right down there. I look forward to talking to you right after the training. First note, before I get into purpose and scope, there is legislation, and it looks pretty favorable for 2021 tax incentives, but the contractor is going to have to install cold climate heat pumps meeting ACA Standard 5. So you have to be a certified contractor and you need to meet these standards, mainly around proving the system was installed and selected and tested, and you have system docs and all the stuff I'm going to cover today. So really what I want to talk about with the standard is the purpose of this way back in 2007 was to really focus on the actual installation and to make sure that the system was selected correctly based on the loads, and it was installed correctly and commissioned, right? And what those parameters look like, what is okay. So this standard does address residential and commercial. The purpose of this presentation is going to be residential systems, and based on the scope of the standard, that's systems that are 65,000 BTUs or less, all right? So when you're talking about a heat pump, it's a 5-ton heat pump or smaller. So this is broken down into 6 basic areas, and I'm going to spend a slide or two on each here, but equipment and equipment selection, the installation of the system and verification, your distribution system, which is typically ductwork, all of the system docs that are required as part of the job folder, owner education, which is pretty implied. There's no direction, just that you actually have to educate the homeowner on how to operate the system. And then, believe it or not, there's some pretty extensive business prerequisites to be part of and meet the ACA Standard 5. So it's not just like you can start a business today and meet the standard. There's a little bit of policies and stuff you have to have in place, documented, in order to meet that standard. All right, so let's roll in. So with equipment, you've got, this is probably a broken record coming from me here, and probably why most of you guys are on my Patreon site, but you got to do a load calc. All right, so you got to do a load calc properly, and you need to select equipment using ACA Manual S and be within that standard, okay? You need to sell matched systems, which have an AHRI certificate, right? This applies to heating and cooling or single and multi-zone systems. It's not like, oh, I'm putting in a VRF multi-zone system in a house, so it doesn't matter. Yes, it matters. It covers all residential systems, all right? Now, the installation. If you have a ducted system, you're going to have to measure the airflow, and the airflow needs to be within 15% of what the design is. And that's measured at the coil. So that means you have to include all that duct leakage, right? Refrigerant charge should be measured. Obviously, you need to have the superheat within plus or minus 5 degrees if this is a fixed orifice system. Subcooling, if you have a TX valve or an LEV, should be plus or minus 3 degrees from the goal. Or if you have a manufacturer like, let's say, a lot of the ductless manufacturers out there where everything is by weight only, you have to meet the manufacturer's charging recommendation. Also, that could cover maybe Lennox that has approach, some other tweaks that are done outside of superheat and subcooling. But it needs to be documented. So what the weight of the charge is and what's weighed in, right? So what the total charge is of the system. Can't just say, yeah, I did it, all right? It's got to be documented. Also, on the installation side, you're going to have to make sure you meet the electrical requirements. So you're talking about line and low voltages, measuring amperage, meeting wire size gauge requirements, grounding the condenser. Yes, that needs to be meeting the NEC, okay, is really important. And then when we start talking about gas appliances, you need to be on rate, meaning you need to verify that the system's firing correctly within 5% of the firing rate. You can clock the meter and get that firing rate in place. But if it's oil, you're talking about measuring the nozzle flow rate, making sure your pump pressure is right, and measuring temperature rise. So depending on the type of system, you would be providing different measurements. It's pretty straightforward there. Your combustion venting systems need to meet local code, right? Obviously, OEM instructions are important, but the National Fuel Gas Code, NFPA, IFGC, all of the venting needs to meet those requirements. I mean, that's basic code. If you're pulling a building permit, it needs to meet that code anyway, or a fire permit for oil, right? And then, of course, system controls, you need to make sure that it's selected and it meets what was spec'd for that. And you keep part of that documentation in the job folder, okay? Now let's get into the fun stuff, right? Like duct distribution. So you need to measure duct leakage, not for the code purpose here, but to meet the ACA standard 5. So if all of your duct work is within inside the building envelope, then you can leak less than 10% of the airflow and it passes, okay? So as an example here, if I had 1200 CFM for a 3-ton unit, this is just generic values, all right? Then I could leak up to 120 CFM. Anything more than that is going to be a problem. It's not going to pass the ACA standard 5. Or Energy Star homes, right? So there's another layer here. So if the if the ductwork is outside the building envelope, they allow you to leak less because that is not going to leak within the building. So you can only leak 6%, okay? And then if it's an Energy Star home, this actually is what most of the 2015 and 2018 IECC and IMC code requirements are. You can only leak less than 4 CFM per 100 square feet that the unit services. So pretty cut and dry there. That's the standard documented tests. Most people will take pictures of the meter with the duct blaster installed on that system, so there's no question that it's not done correctly. I think you're going to find this is going to be more widely accepted that you're going to be able to test your own ductwork coming soon and not rely on a BPI energy rater or a ResNet energy rater, particularly to meet the ACA standard, okay? Now, if you have existing construction, meaning existing ductwork can leak less than 20% of airflow, or you made at least a 50% improvement, which means you have to measure the duct leakage before you rip the old system out, if that's the case. So I highly recommend, if you're trying to meet the ACA standard, let's say this legislation goes through, you test the ductwork and the system in place. Obviously, the new air handler should leak less, I would hope, if you're installing a good quality air handler. So that number should come down anyway. As long as there's a 50% improvement on the duct system, then you're going to meet that standard for duct distribution leakage. Also, you're going to actually have to balance the unit, right? So this is a code requirement that's very rarely enforced, but it will be under ACA Standard 5 if it's for these incentives. So an existing duct system, if you didn't do any modifications, then you don't have to balance the system. But if you did modify it, or if it's new construction and a new duct system, it needs to be plus or minus 20% of the design CFM for that register, or within 25 CFM if it's really small airflow going to that one register. And this balancing requirement is for the supply and the return. Most people don't put balancing dampers in return ducts. So that means you're actually going to have to size the return duct correctly, or put a balancing damper in, which is a huge risk there. So I wouldn't recommend that. I'd say just size the ductwork right. All right. So you do all this testing, okay? And you need to supply all these documents in the job folder to meet the standard. So you have to provide a load calculation. Heat loss and heat gain, ACA Manual J version 8 approved, right? Powered by, it should have this logo on the report that you see on the screen here. Also, you're going to provide the performance information for that system. So a manual S report or the equivalent. Most manufacturers provide software for you to do these calculations, right? It's pretty simple. You're going to have to provide the AHRI certificate or OEM data to prove the efficiencies of the system and the ratings of the system, right? So ideally you're selling a matched system and you have an AHRI certificate, but it's possible you might be installing, as an example, a first company air handler that doesn't have a rating with that condenser. Then you need to provide the OEM data for both in order to make that work. And then of course the startup sheet that has all of the documentation I just talked about regarding airflow, refrigerant charge, electrical measurements, duct leakage, balancing, all that stuff needs to be put on that startup sheet. Pretty cut and dry there, all right? If you don't have this information, part of the technician's guide and workbook, which I'll give you just a little detail at the very end here, has these sort of sheets laid out for you. So like if you don't have a balancing sheet, then there's a layout for you to actually, let's say photocopy it and use that as your startup sheet, right, for that purpose. On the startup sheet, you need to record your measured airflow and if it meets the standard, right? Your measured refrigerant charge. So temperatures, pressures, the whole system. Electrical measurements at that time. The firing rate for gas appliances and oil or fossil fuel burning appliances. Venting meets code. And then of course, duct leakage and air balancing. So all the stuff I mentioned, if you don't know how to do those measurements, or to walk through this as an example, what's approved to measure airflow and how to make that measurement, then that guide, that technician's guide and workbook will actually walk you through each one. Now, business prerequisites. So believe it or not, you have to be licensed. Really important. You need to meet the state requirement for licensing. Some states are really easy, some states are not. So you shouldn't be doing business without a license anyway. Your business needs to be insured, all right? You need to have refrigerant certification. I mean, that's one of those things I got when I was, 14. It was really easy, the EPA certification. I think you can study. It's hard to teach old dog new tricks, but pretty important. You shouldn't be buying a ducted heat pump if you don't have a refrigerant certification. Obviously, this installation needs to meet local codes, which means you pull the building permit. All right, that's important. You're handling refrigerant, that's a hazardous material, so you need to have a hazmat regulation in place for your business, and you need to follow all industry standards and practices. So that's slide one. There's a lot of binders in this picture for a reason. Written policies. So your business needs to have a system performance and evaluation policy. So how you actually inform a customer on what's wrong with a system and why it needs to be upgraded or replaced and meet standard 5, right? So that needs to be a company policy. If it's just you as a salesperson, this is probably easy. If it's not, and you have a large service department, installation department, multiple salespeople, you need to have everybody agree on this policy and have it written down. Of course, you need to provide your continuing education policy to show that your company keeps up with all the most recent equipment, right? You need to have a safety program in place, and also written policy on customer satisfaction and any sort of complaint resolution that needs to take place. So this is the type of thing that you probably want to do when you're not busy before, legislation's in place and everybody that does have it in place gets a jump on you and is able to sell systems using the new tax code. So highly recommend, if you're interested in this, you start documenting some of these items to get it in place for when this is live. You don't want to do it after the fact or do the work and then have to provide that information for any sort of audit, okay? So very, very important. Walk through those items. So last slide here. Today's a quick one. We don't have a lot of people. We don't have anybody on live, so I don't have a lot of questions. So I would expect, if you have any questions, make sure you add it as a comment under this video in Patreon, or everybody has my contact info on here. Feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to answer questions. The additional resource, really high quality. If you don't know how to implement this as a technician doing the startup, or how to do the measurements, or you need basic documentation that you can fill in order to meet the standard, it's $90. It's very inexpensive. Of course, I have the old version here when it first came out in 2007. Obviously, since the standard's been updated, they've updated the QI guide and workbook. The most recent update was 2015. For $90, I'd highly recommend you get it just for the templates. I mean, it's going to save you so much time if you don't have these in place already. So feel free to reach out. I've actually taught all of these pieces in my previous role at a program implementer for rebates in Massachusetts in the past. I've done these measurements and showing contractors how to do this in the field. So I am more than happy to answer questions. So what did you think of the training? Did you like the content? Did you like hearing about the HVAC quality installation spec and all the details required from a contractor? If you did, make sure you subscribe below. Also, if you like this content and you'd like to get it 1 year early, be sure to head over to my Patreon page where you're able to sign up for as little as $8 a month to see these much faster than the rest of the public. As always, thanks again for joining me. I'm Chris with HVAC Pro Blog, where we provide advice for residential system design, quality installation, and system diagnosis. I'll see you soon.